The UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, where the UCLA campus lies today. We also recognize that the UCLA Lake Arrowhead Conference Center sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, the Uhaviatam people. We would like to thank the sponsors of the 2020 UCLA Arrowhead Symposium online series. Their support enables us to bring you today's program. Thank you to the Bay Area Metropolitan Transportation Commission for sponsoring this session. This is an interactive session. To participate in this session, use Zoom's built-in chat, Q&A, and raise hand features.
Good afternoon. I'm Brian Taylor, Director of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies and host of this panel on changing trends in travel behavior. Will they last? In this session, we will examine how travel behavior has changed during the COVID-19 pandemic, including adjustments and substitutions for work, shopping, and other types of travel. We'll also consider how changes in work, shopping, and travel vary by income, race, ethnicity, and occupation. Finally, we will also consider which of these trends are likely to be short-term shocks and unlikely to persist, and which may portend longer changes in activities and travel. Our speakers for today are Dr. Susan Shaheen. She's a professor of civil and environmental engineering at UC Berkeley and director of the University of California Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative. And her talk will be on travel behavior changes during the COVID-19 pandemic. Second, we'll hear from Dr. Giovanni Tchalla, who's director of the Three Revolutions Future of Mobility program at UC Davis. His title of his talk is Temporary versus Longer Term Impacts of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Transportation. And third is Dr. Deborah Salon, who's an associate professor in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University. And she'll be speaking to us on how the COVID-19 pandemic will affect the future of transport. Let me now turn things over to our first speaker, Susan Shaheen.
Thank you so much, Brian. Bear with me while I get up the slide deck. So good afternoon, everyone, or good day, depending on where you're coming from. I wanted to just take a moment to tell you how excited I am to be speaking at the Lake Arrowhead event again. I've had the pleasure of attending the event many, many times in person, and it's definitely one of my personal favorites. So I'm really thrilled to be part of this panel along with Professor Taylor and my colleagues today. So I will be kicking us off. I will be speaking in terms of giving a broad overview of a lot of the behavioral changes that we've seen. And as Professor Taylor mentioned, I am a professor and a director at UC Berkeley, but I now am a director for the Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative on behalf of our 4 UCITS campuses. So just a quick overview to get us started. I'll be honing in on some of the travel behaviors we've seen as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in the areas of e-commerce, telework, vehicle miles traveled, cycling, public transit, as well as shared mobility. Modes like bike sharing, scooter sharing, pooling, transportation network companies, for example. And towards the end of my presentation, I'll be covering social equity considerations and leaving us with a few questions about what's going to stick in terms of travel behavior. So in this particular slide, I wanted to go over some indicators with respect to changes we've seen with both retail and e-commerce. And so it may not come as a great surprise that online purchases grew in the first 6 months of 2020 by about 30 percentage points from 2019. In fact, Amazon Marketplace sales increased 60K as of May 31, 2020, from the prior period in 2019. One of the unfortunate consequences that we've seen is the loss of businesses. And what we've seen is in the United States, about 16 major North American retailers have filed for bankruptcy since the March timeframe. In total, we saw about 21 large-scale retailers closing their businesses, and the impacts are far greater than some of these large retailers. Curbside pickup is also a trend that's different, and I have a image here, figure, representing about a 36 or 37 percentage point increase in curbside pickup among some of the largest retailers in the United States. And that statistic is among about 245 of those ranked in the top 500. Next, I want to talk a little bit about telework. Pre-pandemic and COVID-19. And I've highlighted here the bottom and second quartiles or quintiles on the right with respect to changes in work from home behavior. And you can see to the left that individuals representing the bottom quartile and the second quartile are among those that were able to telework the least. And then following, as you shift your attention to the right, you can see the bottom quintile and the second quintile highlighted there. And we see the biggest changes in both of those quintiles. For the bottom quintile area, we see over 40% working in the telework capacity following the pandemic, in contrast to about 10% prior to that period, represented by 2017 to 2018. And then with respect to the second quintile, we see less of a dramatic change, but an increase to about 30% telework from 20% in the prior period. The other thing that I think is really notable to see here in the right is the impact on individuals who are no longer able to work in a stay-at-home capacity. And you can see the impact is very, very dramatic in contrast to the other quintiles, particularly among the bottom quintile. So there's been a lot of changes with respect to telework, and those changes are not equally distributed among income populations. In this slide, I share with you some survey results that came from a Gartner report in April of 2020, where 370 chief financial officers were asked, following COVID-19, do you envision permanently shifting to more remote work? And what you can see here as of the April timeframe, which is considerably longer ago than today, we see about 23% of the responses represent anywhere from 20% of the workforce remaining remote to about 2% in the more than 50% of their workforce remaining remote. So in this particular histogram, I think it suggests that at this time in the pandemic, employers were not thinking about a massive shift to permanent remain at home work, particularly for large proportions of the workforce. So now turning our attention to vehicle miles traveled, and I know we're going to be talking quite a bit about this, but one of the things that I think is kind of fascinating here is in any given year, US vehicle miles traveled rises or falls about 1 to 2 percentage points. And even during the Great Recession of 2008, VMT declined only about 3.5 percentage points. And I know at that time that seemed quite dramatic. But what's really dramatic, as highlighted here, was the significant drop that we saw around April of 2020 to about 40% in the United States. And so that story plays itself out actually when we get over to some slides setting the stage on what's happening with respect to public transit. With this slide, I'm drawing your attention to some more streetlight data. The previous slide highlighted streetlight data. And this is both streetlight data and a study conducted by BCG. And what I want to do is draw your attention to the two different components of this histogram. So in the top, you can see the map and you see these 4 cohorts. And VMT across this map varies quite a bit among these 4 particular cohorts. For example, the northeastern states witnessed the largest drop in VMT alongside a slower recovery pattern in terms of, say, the phased reopening following shelter-in-place orders. And this correlates with higher average population density, higher professional service employment. In contrast, states with faster recovery trends tended to have lower income levels, less population density, and fewer professional jobs. When we look to the histogram at the bottom of the slide, which really highlights differences between what we would characterize as rural and urban VMT, what you can see here is that throughout the pandemic, the rural areas across the United States did consistently have higher VMT than urban areas as you look to the time frame from March to about mid-July of 2020. There's been a lot of discussion about this vehicle miles traveled. Is this vehicle miles traveled the same as travel that we've seen in the past prior to the pandemic, or has it changed? And when we look at the data here, also coming from streetlight data, we see that there's essentially peak spreading, and we're seeing almost what I would characterize as a bit of a mini rush hour occurring after 12 p.m. And here I highlight both the cities of San Francisco and Los Angeles. And what we see is that millions of commuters who were heading to the office in the AM and spreading out that AM peak are not doing that as much. And so that's introduced new flexibility for midday errands and shopping, for example, as more businesses are gradually reopening. And then also what we see is longer periods of lighter congestion. In both LA and SF, as highlighted here, the PM congestion begins earlier. And as you can see, in contrast to the yellow line, which is 2019, it's ending sooner. So we're seeing the spread out of this VMT. Now, also using some more of our data from the streetlight data sets, this particular histogram is highlighting some changes that we're seeing in bike ridership. And what you can see here is both a table and a figure of the United States, where you can see biggest changes in a negative way, so a decline in yellow bubbles, in contrast to the more blue bubbles, which shows a positive increase. And then when we look to the table to the right, many of the cities highlighted here, when examining May to July, we see actual declines in total bike ridership. And we've heard a lot about, anecdotally, that people are biking more, walking more, in part because of the telework. But this particular research found cycling was dropping in cities that had previously high levels of cycle commuting. And that activity was concentrated during weekdays, naturally, since they were commute trips. And we also note that cycling decreased in those cities less than the total vehicle miles traveled. So this gives some more nuance to some of those anecdotal stories we've heard about the booming. And in some cities, as you can see here, there was dramatic increases as indicated particularly by the blue circles, as well as the table to the right, highlighting cities like Philadelphia, New York City, and Chicago. So this particular slide comes to us from MoveIt and their data set. And I indicate here this fairly substantial decline that we see also occurring around that April 1st timeframe that we saw in the previous histograms regarding vehicle miles traveled. So similar patterns in terms of shelter-in-place orders. These data suggest that there's still dramatic declines in public transit ridership. This figure shows 7 cities, and it highlights data as of mid-October, so October 12th, so just a week or so ago, or a week ago. And what we see is the most dramatic decreases in ridership come from the cities of San Francisco at the highest, Seattle at the highest of 67% decline, followed by San Francisco at 63, and the fewer amounts or less decline occurs in Miami, Florida, and in New York City. So that's just to kind of give us some data to chew on as we think about the impacts of COVID-19 on our behavior. So in the next portion of the presentation, what I really want to talk about is public transit and shared mobility. And as I've already indicated, the impacts on public transit have been quite great. The American Public Transportation Association, Transit Association, forecasted a reduction in fare box revenues of about 75% in just the first 6 months following the pandemic. And so the CARES Act definitely infused a lot of funding into the public transit industry, but we're hearing more and more that the transit industry is in dire straits. In response to the pandemic, we've seen reduced schedules, routing, operations. We've seen transit operators introducing free transit, suspended fares. Sometimes a free transit comes along with just allowing people to enter at the back of the bus, so making it really challenging to collect fares, along with the need to social distance. We've also seen innovations like increases in off-peak or low-density routes in places like Miami through Metrobus Go Nightly. But we see agencies confronted with really difficult choices between reducing capacity and those fare box returns or increasing crowding and how best to rebuild public trust in traveling on public transit. The research in this has been mixed in terms of whether or not COVID transmits easily or public transit being a vector for the virus. Some studies indicate that there is racial disparity in terms of the individuals impacted by COVID deaths. This study by McLaren, as well as one in Maryland by Clipman et al., found a history of infection was actually quite high, 4 times more high and common among respondents who stated that they used public transit 3 times or more in the prior 2 weeks of that survey. Just yesterday, we heard from the CDC. They issued guidance urging passengers and workers of public transit to wear facial coverings during an entire trip journey. So that's a notable change and shift in terms of national guidance. And I think a really important thing for us to ponder in this session and moving forward is how potentially longer term shifts toward telework could ultimately impact public transit service recovery as well as revenues. This slide indicates 2 pretty different scenarios. One in which we could see slow recovery, people exercising social distancing, and really having a fear for higher occupancy modes. And more likely, in this scenario, we see multiple waves of the virus and new viral strands. So how do we cope in a scenario of more decline? And in contrast, a more positive view would be really restructuring transit, re-envisioning how we look at it in terms of helping to advance the economy, getting people to work, focusing on social equity and essential workers, and really providing those services to low-income individuals who are highly reliant on this to get around for their jobs. This particular scenario calls for innovations in bold policy measures, instituting things like subsidies and free transit, as well as advancements in new routing through microtransit back office operations or front-end operations by a third party, and flexible financial models to reinforce this. This is just a quick microtransit case study. Wanted to share with you what VIA has been up to. They've been requiring masks to help with public health and safety, introducing plastic partitions, seating guidance on capacity, increasing vehicle cleaning, in-app wellness checks, and leveraging data for contact tracing. With respect to transportation network companies like Lyft and Uber, as well as pooling overall, which can include any type of carpooling, we've seen dramatic declines in usage. We've seen partnerships, particularly among the transportation network companies, for essential workers and to get people to critical medical appointments. We've also seen the suspension of pooled ride services since March, and we've seen new innovations in terms of growth in foods and goods delivery, driving alongside of that new curbside policies. With respect to micromobility, so this includes not just shared bikes and shared scooters, but people using their own devices or walking. We've seen a lot of different policies here. A number of cities and states are classifying micromobility as essential transportation service, including programs for the essential workers themselves, as well as small businesses. This can include free and discounted memberships for small businesses or the public. And we see this in Kansas City, Memphis, Boston, Brookline, Chicago, throughout the United States. We've also gotten some early indicators that suggest that micromobility is a device people are using to maintain social distancing. And we've also seen from some more recent data that COVID may be contributing to longer micromobility trips. We see this in the MDS, or mobility data specification data, coming out of shared micromobility. We've also seen notable layoffs. We've seen expansion of low-income access programs. We've seen the introduction of advanced technologies like nanoseptic handlebars. We've also seen closing streets and expanding space and accelerating already planned efforts to have dedicated bike lanes. And we've seen brand new use cases for food and grocery delivery services, particularly for vulnerable populations. I wanted to draw your attention here to a resource. My center at UC Berkeley has been part of contributing to this. You can access it at covidmobilityworks.org. And this is an independent platform dedicated to collecting, synthesizing, and sharing mobility initiatives from across the globe on COVID-19. You'll see featured here a lot of activity that reflects partnerships. We have over 250 cities, well over 500 initiatives. And it's really an exciting resource if you wanted to dig in and do some research with it. So as I wrap up, I wanted to draw your attention to some social equity considerations. I'm hoping we'll be able to talk quite a bit more about this today. It's really critical to understand these interrelationships that mobility plays in terms of job and food access, housing, affordable housing, and public health and mobility, and how it continues to play a major role in terms of leveling the playing field for all travelers. So we need to be particularly cognizant of this, particularly as we see the economic effects of this virus hurting most low-income and vulnerable populations. And we need to ensure that lack of mobility does not further exacerbate poverty and homelessness in our state and throughout the nation. And there's many opportunities for us to explore with public transit operators, private partnerships with both public and private sector players in cities to ultimately come out of this virus, strengthening our economy and resiliency, particularly for our most vulnerable populations. So I want to leave us with some questions about what's going to stick from this. How will health and economic crises impact consumer confidence, income, travel behavior, and consumption patterns? Will households choose to deurbanize and move away from cities? What role does telework, telemobility, health considerations, the need for more space, and low interest rates all factor into this? Will consumers resume activity with brick and mortar retail? Will brick and mortar retail be able to survive COVID? And how will this affect our overall quality of life moving forward? And then finally, what happens if a vaccine is ineffective because there's new strains of the virus, or people ultimately refuse to take it? How does that ultimately affect our behavior? So with that, I'd love to thank you for your time and attention, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. And with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker. And I'm going to stop sharing here for a moment. And it's with great pleasure, I want to introduce you to Dr. Giovanni Tchalla. He is the Honda Distinguished Scholar in New Mobility and Director of the Three Revolutions Program at the University of California, Davis, where I also did my PhD. And he is also serving in an additional role as Senior Research Engineer at Georgia Institute of Technology. So happy to introduce you, Giovanni.
Thank you very much, Susan, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to speak to all of you and be here in Arrowhead. Unfortunately, this year, only virtually, considering that the pandemic is not allowing us to meet in person in the beautiful location where usually the conference happens. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and I hope everybody can see it right now. So during the next few minutes, I will give a little bit of an overview of some of the research we're doing in this area. Susan has already given an overview of some of the major trends and the topics that really concerns us in the transportation planning profession nowadays about the impacts of the pandemic. And we're doing at UC Davis, we're doing a pretty large research project to really dive into some of these aspects and also investigate what aspects might actually stick around, becoming more longer term impacts of the pandemic and not just the temporary disruption right now. So clearly, as Susan was already introducing, the pandemic has caused a lot of disruptions that are happening in our society. And when we look at the travel demand side, this of course happens for a lot of reasons, not only the need for social distancing, the huge impacts on employment and travel, but also all the adoption of new technology-based solutions like a smartphone-based app for delivery of food, ICT-based e-shopping, remote working, and so on. But also there are some other indirect effects that happen for a lot of other reasons. So if we look at if you look at the cities, the way they've been reacting to the pandemic over the past few months, we see that there's been a lot of impacts that have been affecting the use of various modes. Of course, the one that were most affected were the shared modes of travel. So the use of public transportation, shared mobility, and for what regards to the car travel, it actually declined, but also already, as Susan pointed, there has been already a rebound that has been pretty strong in a lot of areas where the pandemic has started to improve the situation. And also when we look into the situation with the supply, we see that actually the availability of services is already changing. So the pandemic has somehow accelerated some processes. One of these has been, for example, in the shared mobility area, we have seen the merger between the jump activities of the Uber group together with Lime that now has formed like a larger micromobility company, but in reality also reducing the competition in the market because of where there were two players in the past and now there is only one. And probably as the pandemic lasts, there will be the possibility also for further things that might happen because mergers and acquisitions will continue. There will be more processes with changes in funding availability. Also, the supply of public transportation might change as also agencies are struggling to provide the service in a time of low ridership and reduced revenues. So all these things are really making us think what we should do to regulate transportation in the future. And cities have already started to do a few actions. So one of these is there are evidence that there might be more increased reliance on cars. And to try to counteract that and give more space to pedestrians, bicyclist users, and so on, we've seen already reallocation of space in many cities, in many cases being something only temporary. So some images here we can see on the left our beautiful town of Davis, but also in large metro areas and like the New York City on the right, a lot of big interventions in this area. And I want to quote a blog from the World Bank from a couple of months ago. They were really saying that we now live in a small window of time in which we have the opportunity to transform these short-term responses into long-term changes. And this is really an opportunity to try to steer towards more livable, breathable cities for all. Or, I would add, we could actually go towards more increased car dependence in cities and actually more traffic congestions and problems if travelers start to rely more and more on private vehicles in their future mobility, also after the end of the pandemic. So at UC Davis, we are studying all these topics. We launched a large project that we began in this spring 2020. And this is the combination of a quantitative research approach with also qualitative phone interviews that we're doing. And really we built in this project on the previous studies, because we already had a lot of data we collected in the past 2 years, in 2018 and 2019, in particular as part of 2 research projects, the California Mobility Panel Survey, for which we had a large data collection in 2018, and another study we conducted in 8 large US cities, 3 of which in California, so San Francisco, Sacramento, and Los Angeles metro region in 2019. And so we had a lot of information about travel patterns and all household organization and activity organization of these individuals from before the pandemic. And so we really launched what we thought could be a very interesting longitudinal study in which we have panel data from before the pandemic, during and after. And so we can track, resampling the same respondents, we can track how behaviors and choices are evolving during the pandemic and how also they will continue to evolve in the future. We also decided to recruit additional participants from the same study regions, as well as from other regions of the US and Canada. So the study became a pretty different and larger study, not only resampling previous respondents, but also having repeated rounds of data collection in major regions of the US and Canada in particular. And so here is an overview of our current UC Davis COVID-19 mobility study. It's a large research project. In total, we cover 15 regions of the United States, 2 regions in Canada, Vancouver and Toronto. We have a convenient sample that we also have administered internationally in other countries in cooperation with other colleagues. And so far, we have collected information from more than 11,000 survey respondents. In addition to this, in particular now during the fall quarter and the rest of the 2020, we are conducting phone interviews with selected groups of respondents to go more in depth about specific aspects of how the pandemic has affected the behavior of users. And we have collected a large amount of information with these detailed data collections, and we will continue to do it. We have a new round of data collection that we are launching now during fall, and we will continue to do that in spring 2021 to see how mobility also evolves in the next stages of the pandemic, and hopefully as the situation improves after the end of the pandemic. I'm not providing a lot of information here about the sampling process that we use for this study, as well as social demographic of the respondents. All this information are available on our website. So given the reduced amount of time we have today, I invite you, if you have more interest in that, to visit our website, postcovid19mobility.ucdavis.edu, where we have a lot of information about this project and the early results from this research. I want to acknowledge our wonderful research team with a lot of great colleagues from UC Davis, and also I would say other partner institutions that have really contributed to this effort. And I want to stress the importance of students. We are a university, we do a lot of research with our wonderful group of research students, and they are really like, the future of our transportation field, and I'm very glad for their contribution to this project. So diving into some of the results from our study, I want to first of all highlight, we talk many times about how the pandemic is affecting society. But in reality, when we start diving into a little bit more of the details of who has been affected, how, it's very important to distinguish that there are some sectors of the society that has been not that much affected by the pandemic when it comes to their financial conditions, job, employment, and so on. So maybe they have the inconvenience of working from home For some of them might be a convenience actually, because they might like it, but in the end, they are not really affected that much. I call them the privileged. I think I'm one of them. Many of the people working in the university, we still have a job, we still have a salary at the end of the month, and we still actually can conduct our activities even if the world has been heavily disrupted. But the reality is that there are a lot of other people in our society that have been really struggling. And many of these are really having trouble in getting to the end of the month, paying their bills. And this is really something that is affecting society, not in an equal way across segments of the population. So if we look, for instance, at the various income groups, not surprisingly, the pandemic is somehow affecting in a stronger way those that are belonging to the those that are belonging to the lower income classes, that more often are having they're reporting that they are in financial struggles, and that they are actually having either losing their job or having a reduction in income and so on. While a larger majority of the people that belong to higher income categories are actually having less financial burden because of the pandemic. Well, if we look into other aspects, we can also look at the problem in other ways. So for instance, in this slide, I'm highlighting the differences in the impacts that the pandemic had on employment when we look at different income categories. And so we can see the distribution that those that, for instance, have been furloughed with pay from their previous job, which is more or less the distribution mirroring the total sample that we have in this study for this specific answer. But then when we start looking at those that have been furloughed without pay, we see that those belonging to the lower income categories are more likely to be in the category that actually lost their job without pay. And if we do the other categories and we see those that actually used to work in an employment place that went completely out of business, we see that the pandemic actually has brought much more consequences in terms of employment, in terms of impacts in those that belong to the lower income categories. Now, we could look at these topics from many different angles, but I want to touch, for instance, traveling to work versus teleworking. So in this slide, for instance, I'm showing the difference between the way people used to commute to work. And so on the left side of the slide, you can see the number of days that people on average commuted to work before the pandemic, versus on the right, how they are commuting during the pandemic. And I want also to mention that the sample size for the figure on the right is actually smaller because we already removed all people that lost the job during the pandemic. But even among those that are continuing to have the job, we see there is a massive shift from a lot of people that used to travel to work 5 days or more before the pandemic, that now actually commute to work on average 0 days or only very few days a week. Well, this is, of course, not well distributed in the same way in the population. So if on average we see that moving from 2018, 2019 to 2020, these are data from our longitudinal data set, so people for which we have information from the past and also now during the pandemic, we see there is a massive increase in the number of days people telecommute during the pandemic. This is certainly not equally distributed across different income groups. And so we see that the transition of moving towards working from home is much easier for among those that were actually, they have a high income condition. Medium income is somewhere in between, and the adoption actually of telecommuting is actually much lower among those that have low income. Other aspects that we need to consider. Well, we said that the transit ridership is dropping, but it's also important to see what are the people that are not using transit doing today. Are they just staying at home and it's just like, that those workers are not commuting to work anymore or not making trips anymore? Or are they switching to other modes? Because this is a very important question, because among those that reduce the amount of travel they do with transit, if there is new habit formation, these individuals actually might continue to do so after also the pandemic, if they start having more benefits and they get used to driving a car and so on. And it's interesting to see that among those that actually are reducing the use of buses and public transportation today, we see a pretty substantial amount of individuals that also report an increase in car travel. So somehow this is like, something that is really showing a massive shift that is happening. And of course, like, in the other direction, this is not happening. Among those that reduce their amount of driving, pretty much nobody is increasing the use of transit. Most people actually continue to use it with the same frequency of before, which in most cases means 0 times, because even those that didn't use it before and continue not to use public transit qualify for maintaining the same frequency. The last topic I want to to touch today is related to the changes about the future attitudes. So how people want to travel in the future. And one aspect that is particularly concerning is that at this time during the pandemic, our data are showing a decrease in the interest of adopting a car light or carless type of lifestyle, and in general multimodality. So there is always like, usually a niche of the market that tend to rely on multimodality to have a more like, car light lifestyle, but this niche is shrinking even more during the time of the pandemic as a clear impact of what is happening right now. And this is actually is a concern for the future. So when we look about the expectation the users have in the future, in the near future, they report actually that many of them, they will actually expect to travel more by car to feel safer. And there is hostility towards not only the use of services like ride-hailing, Uber and Lyft, but even like, for the use, for instance, of micromobility. While if we think e-scooters, apart from the potential risk of touching the handlebar, in theory actually could be a rather safe mode because we can have social distancing, and as long as we sanitize and we clean the handlebar, there should be no problems with that. So I want to summarize a few key points that our research is showing and some considerations also for future implications. So the first is really we need to think about equity gaps. It's clear that the pandemic is making the equity gaps that were already present in society bigger. So lower income individuals not only are more likely to have lost their job and to financially struggling, they also are more likely to be essential workers. I didn't report findings in this presentation for brevity, but also our data show this. The transition to e-shopping also can be very dangerous because it can create additional equity gaps, because those that are less familiar with technology, senior citizens, those are less educated, that sometimes are actually have less ability to shop online and might actually suffer more from the retail reorganization. And we need to consider this a lot in our future policies, because also when we think about policies like MPOs are today doing to promote telework, well, this could have a good impacts on the traffic congestion and greenhouse gas emission from the point of view of societal benefits, but also big implications on equity. I also want to touch the topic. A lot of people ask me in many meetings that we have on these topics, are we going to go back to our previous life? And it's a good question. And usually the research has shown that after a big disruption, usually individuals tend to go back to their previous habits and behaviors. But in the longer the disruption, and in this case with the pandemic, we clearly have a case in which there might be actually a very long disruption, which is already lasting almost a year, the higher the likelihood that changes might stay. And also some things are actually happening and they are here to stay. So for instance, the increase in e-shopping is something that is likely to persist because it's just not something happening because of the pandemic, but the pandemic has simply accelerated a trend that was already happening in society with the adoption of e-shopping and with the shrinking of retail space that was already suffering from before. Economic activities will take a lot of time to recover. So already, like, the International Air Transport Association is reporting that probably until 2024, we will not have as much as air travel as we had before the pandemic. So all of these could delay impacts, but they make them longer, but also making them potentially more longer term and I would say permanent. And then also we consider all the other things that we said so far. So big reduction in travel, in particular for the share modes. This is causing issues. All transit operators are concerned today about funding. There is the possibility of having issues in maintaining the level of service in the future. So transportation supply might actually shrink or change in general because of changes in investments, funding, mergers and acquisitions, as well as there are changes in attitudes of the individuals because fewer are interested in a car light and multimodal lifestyle. There is in general more car-oriented travel right now. So there is more need for policies to contain that. And I will abstain from making any conclusions on land use right now. It's a complicated topic, maybe we can discuss more in the question and answer. I think today a lot of people report that they are really thinking to move out of cities, to have more space, have more social distancing, but also this is in part at least the results of a big emotional wave, and so not necessarily this will translate into behaviors. I will pause here. If you have more interest in more information about our project, here is our link. And also I would like to introduce the next speaker, because after me, there will be the pleasure to listen from our great colleague, Dr. Deborah Salon, who is an associate professor in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University, and also the associate director of the Tomnet University Transportation Center. And I would say also that I've had the pleasure to work for many years with Deborah, and it's a pleasure to be with her today. At some point in the past, we used to share an office at UC Davis, so it's nice to be back among friends here. And with this, I will pass it to Deborah, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Great, thank you so much, Giovanni. Is your screen, okay. Hello, everybody. I am very happy to be here, just like my colleagues, Susan and Giovanni. And so my presentation, I'm going to share my screen here, will focus on the future. So our big question is, how will the pandemic affect the future of transport? And I'm gonna, and I wanted to acknowledge, we have a lot of funders of the project that I'm going to be presenting some early results of. And there's a large team of people. Unlike Giovanni, I don't have a slide that shows all of the people that have contributed to this work, but we have other partners at Arizona State with me, other partners at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and it's funded by NSF, Tomnet University Transportation Center, ASU Knowledge Exchange for Resilience, and a program called Converge out of the University of Colorado. So just after I acknowledge all of that, I'll move forward. So just to introduce what everyone has already said in this session, we have made large change. Most of us have made large changes to our daily lives as a result of this pandemic. And just a few specific examples: we used to commute. Now a lot of us are working from home at least some of the time. We used to shop in stores. Now we opt much more often for online shopping and delivery, even for groceries. And we used to fly to meet people for both personal reasons and for business. And now we're doing a lot more video conferencing, again, both for personal reasons and for business. And so the big question that we have on our research team is whether how large are these changes, but also, and perhaps more importantly, will some of these new behaviors stick? Because some people, as both Susan and Giovanni referred to near the end of their presentations, some thought leaders say yes, because this is a very large disruption in our society, in the global society, really. And this large disruption is actually, as Giovanni said, not only continuing and advancing some trends that were already happening, such as the movement toward online shopping and away from brick and mortar retail, but I think it's even kind of more than that, especially on the working from home and video conferencing end of things. I think it's really, there's a lot of learning happening about how we can accomplish a lot of the things that we would like to accomplish in our interactions and in our business interactions and our personal interactions without physically moving around to go places. So we're doing a lot of learning on this. And I think that learning is going to enable much bigger changes than you'd normally see from a disruptive event. In terms of long-term changes. So like Giovanni's team, we have a survey. Our survey is called the COVID Future Survey. You can find it on our website, www.covidfuture.org. And the survey has a number of sections. We ask about people's employment, how they're, whether they're employed or not, in both before the pandemic started, now, meaning during the pandemic, And well, they don't know if they'll be employed in the future, so we don't ask that question in particular for the future. But all these other sections, we ask about working, studying, commuting, shopping and dining, daily travel choices. And for all of those sections, we actually ask the questions 3 times. We ask them about what they used to do before the pandemic, what they're doing now, and then what they expect they'll be doing once COVID-19 infection is no longer a threat. So what I'm going to be reporting on here is a lot of comparisons between what people said they used to do, something about what they're doing now for some of the questions, and then what they expect will happen in terms of their own behavior once the pandemic is over. So the length of it was a pretty long survey, depending on who you were. It took you between 15 and 30 minutes to take it. We recruited people via direct email. We advertised a little bit on Facebook, Twitter. We had our work was featured in the news media with links to the survey, so some people took it that way. And then we actually purchased a lot of email addresses along with mail addresses for thousands and thousands of people. Who knows, maybe someone in the audience received our sort of cold email inviting you to take the survey. And then we also paid an online survey panel company to help us recruit more participants. So we have a lot of different ways that we recruited people. In the end, or at least so far, our sample size is 8,723. These responses, we began collecting responses on April 14th, and the most recent responses we have are from October 14th. So this is a pretty long period of data collection. And that was kind of the first wave of our survey. We're about to be launching a second wave, basically going back to a lot of the people who answered the survey the first time, asking them in a shorter survey kind of how their thinking and their behavior has evolved. And we're going to be doing that a third time in the spring as well. But this, what I'm going to be talking about here, is reporting on just that first very long wave of the survey. Our survey, I'm not going to present, sociodemographics of the actual respondents, but the reason for that is that we've weighted our data to match regional distributions of these variables. So age, gender, education, Hispanic status, vehicle ownership, income bracket, and whether the person lives in a household with children. So just a few quick results is what I'm going to present here. So pandemic experience. One of the questions we asked was whether people had anything, if there was anything about the pandemic life that people appreciated. And this is a word cloud of what some of the text answers to that question was. And I love that it just came out less work, more home time, because I think that summarizes a lot of what people, at least early on in the pandemic, were feeling. But this is a little bit more quantitative view of the answers. So nearly 3/4 of our, not just of our respondents, but of our weighted sample said either yes or maybe to this question: would you like to continue any of these new ways of living after COVID-19 is no longer a threat? So this is indicating that there's a lot of, like I said before, a lot of learning going on about new ways of living and some appreciating of these new ways of living. So we asked, okay, well, which ones? And so this is what we found. So these are the aspects of pandemic life people are enjoying. And number one was working from home some of the time. This is what among employed, only the employed respondents, we asked that question of. So a huge fraction of employed respondents would like to continue working from home at least some of the time. Other things people really appreciate are things like more family time. Interestingly and importantly for the topic of Arrowhead is walking more. A lot of people really are loving getting out and walking in their neighborhoods, walking around their cities. That this was something that 30% of our respondents said, et cetera, et cetera. Another one I'll draw your attention to is the cooking. A lot of people are cooking a lot more and eating out at restaurants a lot less. And I think that is, that's an important indicator for some of the stuff that you see going on in terms of in the restaurant industry. Online shopping, commuting less, driving less, traveling less, as you see coming down here. So there are a lot of things people are enjoying about pandemic life. Not everybody, but some people. So what about working from home specifically? Excuse me. So if we define working from home as people who said they work from home at least a few times a month, the pre-COVID, our respondents said that yes, they worked from home at least a few times a month. 25% of them did that. Right now, it's up to 46% during COVID, and the post-COVID expected doesn't come down very much from the COVID actual. And this was actually a little bit of a surprise to us. We expected it to go up and then maybe come down a lot more than this data suggests that maybe it will. Now, this is not full-time working from home. This is at least a few times a month. But a lot of these respondents, and I'd have to go back to my data to be honest to tell you exactly what percentage, but a lot of them are saying the answer is actually a few times a week. So this is a big, big shift. And actually a lot of the people in the pre-COVID period, worked from home once a week or a couple times a month. And in the post-COVID period, and now they're working from home most of the time. And in the post-COVID period, they say, we want to work from home at least a few times a week. So there's a lot of increase in working from home is what we see in our data. And here's one of the reasons for it. Most of our respondents report stable or increased productivity working from home. But I'll just highlight the ability to work from home is highly unequal. And, Giovanni broke this out as well. By income, we broke it out by educational attainment, showing that 38% of those without a bachelor's degree were able to work from home. But if they did have a bachelor's degree, that number is over 80%. So that's a really, really big difference. I've heard some other people refer to this as social distancing privilege. And basically people who are higher educated and with higher incomes have that privilege, and people who are not often don't. But anyway, as a result of this tremendous potential increase in working from home, demand may change or we expect demand to change for office space, for services in office districts, for restaurants, and other services. Home office equipment may go up. And obviously the big one, commuting, and we'll come back to that. Another big thing that we find is a very big difference from pre-pandemic to the expectation of post-pandemic is air travel. So we find that for business travel, 42% of our respondents said that they plan to be flying less post-COVID than they used to. And for personal travel, it's more like 36%, but that's still a large decrease in travel. And there's this question of, well, why? So we also asked in our survey, why the change? And you can see there's quite a bit of a difference between the respondents who said they were going to travel less for business reasons and the respondents who said they would travel less for personal reasons. And you can see that virtual interaction, meaning, Zoom meetings like we're having now, is a huge reason for business travelers to travel less, and much less of a reason for personal travelers to travel less. And on the flip side, feeling uncomfortable sharing space, even in a post-COVID world, is more of a reason for personal travelers and less of a reason for business travelers. And I think as people, if the threat of pandemic infection really goes down, I think what this is telling us is the personal travel may come back, but the business travel, I think, has a potentially permanent decline. And this is going to be really big for both airlines and airports. And how should they plan for their future? And so the last thing I'll talk about is daily travel and our results on this. And this is not just commuting, but just how many times you make trips by different modes, sort of on a regular basis. So we divided our sample into people who were regular users of each mode, defined here as a few times a week or more. And so 80% of our sample used cars regularly, 13% were regular bikers, and 22% were regular walkers. And you see here that there's some people who say they're going to do it more in a post-pandemic situation, and some people say they're going to do it less. Most people say they're going to stay the same as they used to. But these big boxes around large potential increases for both biking and walking really give you pause, right? Because right now maybe not right now, but especially in the beginning of the pandemic, there were the streets got quite a bit safer, right? Because there were a lot fewer people traveling by car, as we saw in the previous presentations. And some cities were closing streets to car traffic in order to allow people to walk and bike on them. And a big question is, can cities continue this? And I know this has been a topic of conversation in the media as well. Can cities use these kinds of data to support allocating more street space in a post-pandemic world for pedestrians and cyclists? And I think that's a really great question and an interesting conversation that hopefully we'll be having later. And then the other travel modes we looked at were transit and ride hailing, or shared micromobility. And here we see more of a balance, which I thought was interesting, a balance between people saying they would use it less and people saying they would use it more in a post-pandemic world. But it still raises questions about what does that mean for the future, especially for transit agencies, but also for micromobility companies. And I just want to highlight again that these are expectations of change. It's not revealed preference behavior. It's not what actually has happened, because we haven't gotten to that point yet. But I think these data are really important to try to help us understand what the future may look like. We are going to be sharing our data. So if you're interested in that, hopefully the data sharing link will actually be coming soon at covidfuture.org. We're working very hard to get that up. And I'm going to stop right there and say thanks so much for listening. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. And I'll turn it back over to Brian. I think.
I'm just here we go. Okay, thank you all very much. I want to check on the audience Q&A. So let's go to a few of them. I have a few questions I'm dying to ask, but I want to make sure that some of the people asking questions can get in. So Jacob, who's monitoring the questions, do you have the first person lined up for the speakers?
Yeah, our first question comes from Ellen Greenberg of Caltrans.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for the presentations. Really interesting. The thing that is really curious to me is the extent to which we've seen a VMT rebound in a period when many people are working remotely, many schools, businesses, entertainment venues are closed, and we have an overall shrinking of the economy. So I have a few theories, but I'd like to hear your theories because it does seem counterintuitive.
So thanks for that question, Ellen. It's great to see you. Earlier in the presentation that I gave, I showed some data from Streetlight that showed what was happening with VMT. So we're not quite at the same level of VMT as pre-COVID, but what we're seeing is this spreading out and what I would characterize as almost like a mini rush hour that happens afternoon and takes us into the afternoon. And so I think a lot of the experts interpreting this type of data are saying that people are changing their trip making patterns. So maybe they're not rushing out at 6 a.m. for a long commute in, but they're taking errands and going on appointments and doing shopping midday when previously they weren't able to do so.
And I can add something on that. In one of my slides, I was actually touching this topic related to how certain individuals have changed their use of different modes. And you raise a very important topic, Ellen, because indeed, there is a general reduction of the activities, and so many people are working from home, many fewer people are commuting to their jobs. But at least a portion of the rebound we see in car travel can be attributed to mode shift. So at this point, there is a sharp reduction of people that are using public transportation. It was not that big in most metro areas, but it's shrinking further. And there is a reduction of other modes, like, the ridership for shared mobility has gone down a lot. So pretty much everything that is not using a car, and to some extent walking and bicycling, are still there. but there has been a shift from these other modes into car travel. And so that, at least in part, compensate. I think it would be very desirable to look more at distances of trips and different trip purposes to really explain that in more details. It's part also of what we are try to look into more, like, details. So one of the issues is having the correct data. So among all our respondents, we could do that part of that portion of the analysis. Actually, we did it for the California State Agency, not yours, another one. The California Resources Board was asking us exactly that question. And we could answer it for a small sample, because for the individuals for which we had longitudinal data from before the pandemic to really compare how they have changed. And I really don't want to claim that to be representative, because it's such a small sample that might be skewed towards a certain groups only, but it somehow is indicative of something that is happening somehow in society.
Giovanni, is it, or any of you, is the data surprising to you? Is this what you would have expected to see in terms of VMT?
It's the rebound is happening and the mode shift is happening is not surprising. The amount of the rebound is somewhat surprising. I would say, because clearly a lot of individuals are not back to their current regular life from before the pandemic. They're working remotely. Shops are, like, not working as they used to do in the past. Restaurants are closed or working at reduced capacity depending on the region. So they should be. I think the amount of the rebound, the size, the magnitude is somewhat surprising.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised by the mini rush hour and how long it is at midday. A little surprised by that, but definitely not surprised to see people getting their own cars and shifting away from higher occupancy modes, and thus increasing VMT.
Okay, thank you. And we'll get Deborah in, I think, on hopefully on. Oops. Jacob, you have someone else queued up for a question. Is that right?
Yeah, our next question is from Jody Whitbeck of LA Metro.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I posted my question early when Susan was speaking, and it's interesting to see how the conversation has evolved, including in the chat from Sarah, something that I'm a little depressed about. But Susan talked about employers who were thinking about continuing to allow people to work from home, presented it almost as if it was an all or nothing thing. And Deborah presented information that said, but the people who are working from home want to continue to do that at least some of the time. And that's me, absolutely. And I'm wondering, are there employers who are willing to consider something between all or nothing for those jobs where you don't have to be there live and in person all the time?
So Jody, I just wanted to clarify with that particular slide. I think I probably went over it quickly. It is reflecting what percentage of the workforce. So that doesn't mean if they say 17% of those employers are open to 20% of their workforce. It's not 20% of the workforce, but 24% of the workforce time.
Okay.
And so a lot of the policies that I've been seeing, including one that MTC has proposed recently, I don't know if you've seen that as part of Plan Bay Area. They've been talking about something actually quite aggressive with major employers in the Bay Area going to a 60% workforce each day as a target on a typical weekday. And that could be achieved through compressed work schedules, through flexible work schedules, and overall remote work policies. And their goal ultimately is to take us from pre-COVID 14% telework share up to 25% telework share. Great. But I think their idea of that 60% workforce is it's 60% workforce on a given day reduction.
That's I feel
So
much
thank you
better.
for your question. And sorry, I was trying to go through so much data as quickly as I could. So
No, it's fine. That's the nature of this, but I'm glad to hear that, because I think there are things about this current environment where you miss the personal interaction, but there's things, you know, I don't want to completely give up either, and I know I'm not the only one.
I just want to jump in for a second. I know we're running short on time, so I actually wanted to address a different question that came on the chat about this same topic, which is this issue of, well, so your data says that people want to work from home. What are the employers going to let happen? And this is something that in a different webinar scenario, I got that same question from somebody else. And the way I think about it, I guess I'm trained as an economist, so full disclosure. So I think like there's two sides to the employment market, right? And I think if there's a lot of, I mean, obviously the employees don't have full control over whether they work from home or not, but they don't have no control either. So I think if there's a lot of demand for at least part-time working from home, it's really likely that employers are going to start offering that. I don't have any, you know, I haven't surveyed employers myself, so I don't know exactly how many or under what circumstances. But I think given the demand, I think it would be shocking if somehow it becomes unallowed, right?
Thanks, Jody. I had one quick thing I wanted to toss in here. I think that almost by, there's a selection bias in the audience that almost all of the people here have some capacity to work from home. So there's a tendency to focus a lot on that. But you also, all of you mentioned various aspects of people who are either more financially strained by this, are mobility impaired, are riding transit still or have concerns about it, or other kinds of issues like that. One question is that in the 2000s, we have seen auto access gradually rising across the income spectrum, more in the 2000s than the 2010s. And the question is on one hand, we have an economic shock, and we know that the most economically precarious are more likely to be struggling financially. On the other hand, it raises a question whether you anticipate that there may be more effort to access automobiles and use them among low-wage workers, those who are working in service occupations or in frontline occupations over time. Is that something that may come out of this pandemic as well? So we're talking a lot about VMT and work from home for maybe more educated, higher income workers. What about these lower wage workers? And what kinds of, what do you see with respect to auto access driving and coming out of the pandemic?
I think it is very possible that we might be going into a new era of increased auto use and increased car dependence. That is very likely, and it's likely actually that it might happen also among different groups and segments of the population. And of course, like, you know, the question whether individuals can afford to own a car is a different question, but in many cases it's not going to be new cars, it's going to be used cars bought on the used car market. So even those, like, you know, can reduce, like, you know, the barriers to car ownership for many groups, not for everybody, of course. But I think also it will depend a lot on a few counteracting forces and which one will prevail. So on one side, there is probably a tendency that could have more increased car use for the reasons that we discussed. There is the big question of what the cities and the agencies will implement in terms of policies to promote car alternatives, but also in terms of potential developments in land use. We haven't talked a lot in this panel yet about land use and urban form, and it's an open question how cities will evolve in the next few years in terms both of the supply of transportation options and the policies and development in the real estate market and land use. And then there is a third component, which is the economic activities. And the economic activities is also a big question mark. We hear everywhere in the media and also, like, you know, in a lot of different environments, a discussion about a V-shaped recovery, a W-shaped recovery, a K-shaped recovery, and all those other factors. But there's also a question about equity and distribution of income and the salary levels. And that affects a lot about also the purchasing power, because one thing is having an interest in purchasing a car. Another thing is to have the ability to buy a vehicle and pay for the maintenance and all the costs associated with this. And a lot of countries around the world, including the US, we are actually seeing an increase of the percentage of individuals that are below the poverty level. And this is actually, unfortunately, that is happening. There is the possibility to counteract on that also through policies, but it also depends on decisions which are made at the federal level, state, regional, and local level. And so somehow we need to see how the balance will play out with all these different forces.
I'll just say, I think Giovanni is as well in his survey, but we collected data on whether people had, gained or shed vehicles during this pandemic period, and we're going to be doing that in our next wave survey. So I don't know the answer to what our data say, because I haven't really looked at that, but in depth. But if you want to contact me later, I can tell you what our data say.
Okay, just turn it back to the audience. Jacob, I think you have someone else lined up with a question.
Yeah, we have a question from Sarah Jones of the SFMTA.
Unmuting the challenge of COVID right now. So I think I keep thinking back to last year at Arrowhead and how much we talked about how important transit service is from an equity standpoint. And right now San Francisco's transit, everybody's transit is really strapped, and we have implemented and are facing more service cuts, which kind of brings me back to some of the ideas that Susan brought up around micromobility as an option, micromobility, microtransit, all of that as an option. But I know our city has been very resistant. I see Susan nodding, very resistant. And now that's really coming back to bite us now. And I'm just wondering if you have any examples or have seen some really positive trends in cities that have successfully been able to pivot quickly around micromobility and privately provided options.
Thanks for your observations on that, Sarah. There are a lot of cities in the US that I think are seizing this moment to work hand in hand with the private sector, if it be a back office operation. So the transit provider is providing that service, but downsizing the vehicle and using the technology and the data to start figuring out what the right route should be. And so we're seeing that in a lot of different cities, including Chicago looking at it, and a lot of great leadership also coming from Jacksonville, Florida. So I think a lot of places are looking at this, Los Angeles. And I think this is a moment to reevaluate those policies around jitneys, for example, that go back to the 70s, right, in SF, where it was really deemed as either a competition to public transit or to taxis. And so now that we see public transit, really fighting for survival and the critical role it plays to provide mobility, almost acting as a social service to our society, the partnership opportunity, I think, presents us with a great one. But if there's policy roadblocks, that's going to present a challenge to using that technology and that knowledge of operations and real-time data to our advantage. So I think you're right, and the way that cities are responding across the globe is different. That COVID Mobility Works data set can give you a lot of great examples. I was recently having a conversation with a colleague from Calsta who is telling me about the city of Zurich and how their operations and logistics can just basically go upscale or downscale quite easily, because they were prepared to understand their routes with data real time in such a way that they could scale back 30% or go up 10%. And so when COVID hit, they were able to adjust really well. So I also think we should look at international examples.
Great, thank you. I'm very excited to check out these resources. Huge bonus for us. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Jacob, and next question.
Yeah, our next question comes from Professor Michael Manville.
Hi, everybody. Great presentations by all of you. It's great to see you all. I guess this is to the group. It was prompted by something that Deb mentioned in her presentation, where she showed the people's self-assessments of their home productivity. And of course, people seem to think they were pretty productive. And I guess the two-part, or the big question is, like, how seriously should we take that? Because I often think I'm like really kicking butt here at home, and then I really have no idea. But the larger issue that I think sometimes I don't hear as much about is that one thing we know about productivity is that it tends to come in big bursts. And the big bursts tend to come oftentimes from sort of serendipity. And one aspect of a Zoom economy is that there are almost no unplanned interactions, that it's very hard to have an unintentional encounter with someone. And so I wonder how we factor the lost productivity of the absence of serendipitous encounter into our assessments of how productive people actually are.
I think someone else had a similar question, I think. Anson Stewart did. I think that's a great question. And I think I've seen in the news a lot of companies trying to start to grapple with that and say, oh, well, maybe we don't want to go 100% remote because of that exact reason. We don't want to sort of cut short those kinds of interactions. And yeah, so I guess, but I had another thought I wanted to add to that. Oh yeah, I wanted to say in our survey, we asked not just, the only thing I presented was the productivity change, yes, no, or it was a little bit more varied than that, was the possibilities for answers. But we asked why also. So we asked what the reasons that people said, if they said their productivity went up or down. We said, well, what are the reasons? And I didn't present that, but the reasons made a lot of sense, right? The people who said they had lower productivity were often, parents with children at home, or people who just didn't have enough space in their homes to have a good work environment, or people who just like to work around other people, sort of like social beings, right? More and more people. So, and on the other side, people who said they were more productive cited things like, well, I don't have to commute anymore, so I've got more time in my day. Like I can do more. I'm more effective at multitasking with home tasks and work tasks. So I think. So I just wanted to clarify that it wasn't just the one question. It was that question and then some supporting, I think, evidence that would indicate that the answers were not totally just people making it up. Yeah.
Mike, I think you made a brilliant comment. It's really very, very important topic. There has been recently also a comment, I think it was the CEO of a big airline, that said that the moment in which a company realized that they are losing sales because somebody's showing up in person to their customers and they're making the contract and taking clients out, there will be the time in which people will jump out of Zoom and start flying again to meet their customers in person. And certainly, personally, as an Italian, I know that a lot of contracts and a lot of ideas many times start taking a coffee with somebody, and sometimes even outside of a formal meeting, but just with some ideas or with something that is brainstormed in a very informal setting. And we certainly are losing that. And we discuss this all the time with our students about the next conferences, how they will be missing all that potential meeting with potential employers, potential other partners for research and so on. And I think probably this will be also something that will balance out the future. In our study, like Deborah, we are also trying to map all these things and collecting data. We will continue to do it. But I think also this will be something that will probably lead to some mixed kind of scenarios. So I don't really believe that people will continue to do things as we do them today. permanently from home, working entirely 100%. Sure, a small minority does it, but the balance between the convenience of working from home for the privileged ones that can do it, and also the larger acceptance that there is nowadays between among employers and employees of telework, because in the past it's always been kind of, not always perfectly acceptable, but now it's more socially accepted. So then this might lead that to those that are working from home 5 days a week right now, and in the past were going to the office 5 days a week, they might be more likely in the future to work 3 or 4 days a week in person in the office and remain 1 or 2 days at home, taking the benefits of both worlds somehow. And then there could be many other considerations, but I don't want to take too much time, and we're already running out of time.
So I wanted to just jump in on this for a minute. It's great to see you, Mike. I just read a really fascinating article from Chicago Business Times about a recent survey that was done about the pandemic, and that most workers want to return to the workplace full-time or part-time, and only 12% of them want to work from home all the time. And what they found really interesting in the survey, which I think is intuitive for my colleagues that do the travel behavior surveys on this issue, is that the millennials really were previously asking for a lot of flexibility in the workplace, and apparently they want to get back into work. As Deborah mentioned, they don't have the space, and they're finding it hard to do their jobs and feel more distracted at home. So they want that social interaction. And in fact, a good proportion of the people responding were actually coders, and they're finding it hard to code in isolation.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
So I don't think that we have time for another question here at the end. And some of the listeners know that they have been being polled as they go along. And Juan Matute is going to quickly present the results to us.
Well, they should be on the screen now, Brian.
Yeah, so you can see, have you watched one of your favorite restaurants go out of business recently? 6 out of 10 people have said yes. And has your impression of telecommuting or work from home changed since March of 2020? And most people said more favorable. And I only know from reading the literature, I understand that that the literature suggests that employers were always nervous about work from home because of having employees out of sight and away, and would they be productive? And workers worried about loss of home work-life balance. So we've been forced to experiment with this. But one thing if you had a quick comment here, and we could just wrap right up, is that there's a huge difference between people who have been pushed into this, who've also at the same time been pushed into doing childcare, homeschooling, or elder care, and others who haven't. So that in your samples, when asked about working home, have you been able to control for that? Because I would suspect that someone who is working from home for the first time and is also trying to take care of an older parent and to homeschool their children is having a very different experience than either someone on the younger side of the workforce or later in life when they have adult children, or who do not have those responsibilities. They're having a very different work experience. And I'm just wondering if you've differentiated those in terms of how people have reacted to this experience of working from home.
I think Deborah touched this topic a little bit before, and I will also confirm that in our data, we have been controlling that, and we see actually differences in the adoption of telecommuting, but also working from home, but also the frustration associated with teleworking. And this is actually something we're digging more with qualitative interviews to really see what is behind. That is not easy sometimes to collect information on with the quantitative surveys, and really see the dynamics in the household, also in terms of the size of the home, the availability of space, the presence of children, and so on. Also, another topic we didn't touch, it's also that many people have set up home offices. So somehow the pandemic has pushed individuals to buy external screens, monitors, new software, new hardware, to somehow making work from home easier. And that could be actually somehow an enabler for some users to continue to do that in the future, simply because it's easier to work from home now, after they had to receive that push from the pandemic to set up that home office that they never did it before. And in the past, they just had the laptop they had to put somewhere on the table if they wanted to work from home.
Okay, I guess we'll give Giovanni the last word. This is normally where I would say it's time for us to thank all of our panelists, and everyone would start applauding, and we'll just have to imagine that that's occurring. I don't even think this one allows for people to put up little applause. But I want to thank our three panelists for a fascinating discussion, and I want to thank my former employer, the San Francisco Bay Area Metropolitan Transportation Commission, for sponsoring this session. And I want to thank all of you who participated listening in and with your questions. I know we weren't able to get to them all, but hope this is the beginning of a conversation and not the end. Just to let you know that our next session in this series will be Friday morning at 10 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time, and it features research presentations on the impacts of transportation finance. Thank you all so much. Goodbye.